Episode 4. The Sacred Retreat, the second resistance against the Yuan invasion. After the call of the mountains and rivers had echoed through the burning words of the royal proclamation, Đại Việt was no longer a silent land standing beneath the shadow of the north. From the capital of Thăng Long to the villages along the rivers, from small ferry docks to military camps hidden beside the forests, the hearts of the people began to gather into a quiet but powerful flame. Young soldiers looked at the swords in their hands with different eyes. Elders who had lived through seasons of war quietly told their children to hide food, protect the villages, and trust the court. Yet while the spirit of Đại Việt was being forged, the hooves of the Yuan-Mongol army had already begun to shake the frontier. In 1285, the true storm of war descended. These were no longer threats carried by arrogant envoys. These were no longer distant warnings from the northern border. Hundreds of thousands of Yuan troops poured across the mountains like a flood of iron, carrying the terrifying momentum of an empire that had forced many kingdoms to bow. At the border gates, dust rose beneath the hooves of Mongol cavalry. War horns, battle drums, and the clash of armor thundered through the mountain passes. The defensive lines of Đại Việt trembled under the terrible pressure of the invading force. The Tran army resisted fiercely at Noi Bong and Chi Lang. But before the overwhelming attack of the enemy, the first lines began to break. News of early defeats reached the capital and made every heart heavy. But Trần Hưng Đạo understood one truth clearly. The first defeats of a campaign did not decide the destiny of a nation. What mattered was whether Đại Việt could preserve the king, preserve its main forces, preserve the hearts of the people, and preserve the right moment to strike back. He did not look at war with the impatience of one battle. He looked at it with the vision of an entire nation's survival. If Đại Việt threw all its strength into a direct battle while the enemy was still fresh and powerful, everything could be lost in a single day. But if the army withdrew at the right time, if it gave the invaders an empty capital, if it drew them deep into a land without food, without support, and without the loyalty of the people, then the enemy's enormous strength would slowly become the very burden that crushed them. And so, a painful decision was made. Thăng Long had to be abandoned. The capital had to be emptied. The people had to withdraw. Food stores had to be moved. Anything that could not be taken away had to be hidden or destroyed so the enemy could not use it. This was not surrender. It was another way of fighting, colder, more patient, and more terrifying than any reckless battle. When the order to evacuate was given, Thăng Long entered a scene it had never known before. Streets once filled with life became crowded with hurried footsteps. The elderly were helped along. Children were carried toward the river landings. Wagons of supplies moved through the night. The sounds of doors closing, oars striking water, and soldiers passing orders filled the cold mist. No one wanted to leave the capital. No one wanted to watch the place they loved become an empty city. But the people of Đại Việt understood that leaving today meant returning tomorrow. Trần Hưng Đạo stood among that moving tide of people without showing panic. His eyes passed over the rooftops, the roads, and the walls of the city as if he were carving every part of Thăng Long into memory. He knew the enemy might enter the capital, but they would never capture the soul of Đại Việt. The Tran king and the royal court withdrew southward. It was not an easy retreat. Behind them, the Yuan army pursued closely. Ahead of them lay long roads, deep rivers, unfamiliar crossings, dense forests, harsh weather, and the hearts of men being tested to their limit. Every passing day could become the final day if the royal escort were overtaken. Every riverbank could become a place of life or death. Every forest could hide the enemy. In those hours, Trần Hưng Đạo was not merely a general commanding troops. He was the shield before the throne, the lamp that kept the army's spirit from going out. He personally directed rearguard units, launched small delaying attacks, destroyed bridges, blocked roads, and forced the enemy to slow down even though they were far greater in number. These rearguard battles were not meant to win glory. They were meant to buy time, and each hour was worth more than gold. Holding a riverbank for half a day meant the king could move farther away. Destroying a road meant the enemy cavalry might lose another night. A small group of soldiers staying behind could give the whole court one more chance to survive. The greatness of this retreat did not lie in the roar of victory. It lay in the silent endurance of those who understood that they were doing what the nation required. Meanwhile, the Yuan army entered Thăng Long and believed that victory was already in their hands. But before them was not a wealthy capital full of food and supplies. What they found were empty streets, silent homes, cold kitchens, and storehouses stripped bare. They had captured the city, but they had not captured rice. They had a vast army, but every day that army demanded more food. They had powerful horses, but horses could not eat stone, drink mud, or survive on an empty capital. The trap of Đại Việt began to close around the invaders while they were still drunk on pride. The deeper they advanced, the farther they moved from their base. The harder they pursued, the more exhausted they became. The heat of the southern land, the unfamiliar climate, the countless rivers, the broken roads, the vanished population, and the shrinking supplies all began to work against them. Soldiers who were used to quick victories were forced into a long war where the enemy refused to stand still and be destroyed, yet appeared at the right moments to cut roads, ambush supply parties, and vanish again. This was the War of Đại Việt. It was not loud or boastful, but it was as persistent as water wearing down stone. During the retreat, the situation became so dangerous that the Tran king was said to have asked whether surrender should be considered. This was not the question of a coward. It was the burdened voice of a ruler thinking of countless lives under the weight of disaster. When a whole kingdom is pushed into darkness, the one who wears the crown must think of every possible road. But Tran Hung Dao answered with words that would be carved into history. Your Majesty must cut off my head first, then surrender. Those words were more than the loyalty of a general to his king. They were the oath of an entire people before destiny. They declared that Đại Việt might lose cities, might retreat, might suffer hardship, but it would never hand its soul to the invader. In that moment, retreat was no longer mistaken for fear. It became part of the will to fight. Withdraw to preserve strength. Withdraw to wait. Withdraw to strike harder when the enemy had grown weak. The king heard those words. The soldiers heard those words. The people heard those words. And in the darkest hour of the nation, a path of light remained. The retreat continued. Thanh Hoa and the southern regions became places where the army could preserve its strength, rebuild its forces, gather food, protect the people, and wait for the right moment. Along muddy roads, Tran soldiers marched forward while looking back toward the north. They were not abandoning their country. They were carrying the country with them. In their hands were weapons. Behind them were villages. In their hearts was Thăng Long. Tran Hung Dao understood that the enemy might win a chase, but they could not defeat a people who knew how to turn an entire country into a battlefield. Every riverbank, every field, every boat, every villager could become part of the strategy. The people were not outside the war. They hid food, carried messages, guided soldiers, destroyed roads, concealed boats, and remained silent so the enemy would see only an empty land. That silence unsettled the Yuan army. They could not understand how they had occupied land without controlling the people. They could not understand how they had won battles yet moved farther away from victory. They did not understand that Đại Việt was not fighting the war they wanted. Đại Việt was pulling them into a war of time, hunger, exhaustion, and will. Day after day, the invading army began to lose the terrifying force it had shown at the beginning. Horses grew tired. Soldiers far from home became restless. Supplies ran low. The humid heat wore down their bodies. Pursuit became slower. Foraging parties became vulnerable to ambush. Supply lines were cut. In the enemy camps, confidence slowly turned into irritation, then anxiety. On the side of Đại Việt, hardship was still everywhere, but something vital had been preserved. The main army remained. The king was safe. The people had not broken, and the supreme commander still stood firm. That was the meaning of the sacred retreat. It was sacred not because it had no loss. It was sacred because, in a moment that looked like defeat, it preserved everything needed for future victory. It was sacred because it turned humiliation into strategy. It was sacred because it demanded that a leader endure misunderstanding in the present in order to win survival for the future. When the Yuan army became exhausted by heat, hunger, and the long struggle inside a land that refused to submit, the chance for counterattack began to appear. The rivers that had once helped the retreat would become paths of advance. The forests that had hidden the people would now hide ambushes. The boats that had fled in darkness would return carrying soldiers and weapons. Trần Hưng Đạo saw this before many others did. He knew the war was not over. The most painful part had passed, but the fiercest part was about to begin. Đại Việt had withdrawn far enough to avoid being crushed. The enemy had advanced deep enough to place itself in danger. Now the pieces of the battlefield began to come together. From the emptiness of Thăng Long, from the muddy steps of the retreat, from the refusal to surrender in the darkest hour, a wave of counterattack was silently forming. And when the moment finally ripened, the invaders would no longer hear the sound of a nation running away. They would hear the sound of Đại Việt returning.